Sorry, I forgot to start the recording.
Yeah. So
Yes, it's definitely a terrestrial orchid. It's growing in kind of a peat moss and it's like the moss mix. Okay, so Andrea.
so you do that, whatever.
Hold on,
Read it. You can read it.
We'll see which one he pulls. I think you're next.
I think the, yeah.
I can never pronounce the names. What is it?
Hold on. It's not open yet, right? I couldn't see that.
It's just.
Oh, look at me.
So can you bring it over here? Will that work? Can we do?
You want to do a live in room?
Yeah, let's try a live and let's see how this works.
Falling over. Yes.
Now Pro.
I'm not good at this.
How do we do here? You do it.
Come back right there.
You're muted.
No, we're not. So Catasetum, Chuck Taylor, way good. I got tagged there. By Catasetum, Susan Fuchs, Burgundy Chips, FCC. So I think this is going to be a female flower. If you look really close, you can see that you're getting some petals separation in there. When they're really, really, really happy, the female, oh, I love that. When they're really, really happy little flowers, they become females. When they aren't very happy and the plants are small, they're males, and the male flowers are prettier. Okay.
And the sound is much better.
And Dormadol winner. Okay. Next.
Hello, I have 3 plants. Where's the camera? There. There you go. This is Pescatoria soelestis. Pescatoria soelestis from Ecuador, cloud forest. I grow this cold with 52 nights and it likes lots and lots of water. I imported this thing beginning of this year and this is already blooming. It had 6 buds, but only 3 survived. And the flowers are nice and big and very, very blue. They're supposed to be fragrant, but I haven't detected anything yet.
Because you're wearing a mask.
Even without mask. And then I have, yes, this is Paphiopedal, which is a natural hybrid of Esquirali and Helena. No. And I also grow this pretty cool cold year round.
Look at that. That's
tiny.
hand. That is a small little thing.
Yes.
Okay.
And this is Dendrobium normanbiense, which is now a species, I think, since 2 years ago, it was elevated to species status, and before it was supposed to be a miniature version of Dracula Vespertellio. Really cute.
That is awesome.
Blooms very prolific, and this is a long blooming. So this started about 2 months ago, and it's just keeps blooming and blooming, and the spike dies, and then another one comes out. So there's multiple spikes coming out of each row suitable with this.
Cool. Okay.
That's it.
What's next? Oh, there she goes. The floor is yours.
I have another one over there too.
Okay.
Okay, this is a hybrid. It's a hybrid. It's Potinara, Loud Nice, SFO Best by SLC Circle of Life, Fordyce, Harold, Angel, and it's an AM AOS. There's one really nice bloom on this one here. So that's, yeah.
Smile.
Yeah.
There you are.
There you are. It's got a beautiful color.
I'll get you in there too.
Yep. Got it.
But this bloom here is very nice flat one, this one here.
Okay,
So,
and this is the last one,
yeah,
which we showed someone built.
yes.
Yeah, that's a better one.
So this is another. We'll trade hands. This is another Stenoglottis longifolia, and I've been growing this out on my deck all summer, so it's actually very dormant, going very dormant now. And as soon as it stops blooming here, I'm gonna put it inside my sun porch to just rest for the winter. Give it a dry rest. There you go.
All right, which is, and then I'm gonna, so this is what we were just looking at. Yep. And then the last one
It's Jeffers one plant.
is Japhas plant, which is, what is it?
Oh,
DLC King's Ransom. All right, that's pretty. Okay. Now, we're gonna move on to Lynn. All right. Are you ready, Lynn?
You're muted, Lynn.
I'm ready. Here we go. Hold on. Hi, Tom.
Are muted? Lynn, are you muted?
There, can you hear me?
Yeah,
And do you see full screen without my notes?
yeah.
Oh, excellent. See how easy that is when Tom's right here? Hold on. Okay, so here we go. We have another gorgeous virtual show and tell table. I think we have 53 stunning orchid photos, 17 contributors, including some new contributors. I really appreciate the time it takes for you to photograph and send me your photos for show and tell. So let's get started. And as always, the order in which you see them is the order in which I receive them. So this is Tyler Albrecht. This is his debut on our virtual show and tell. And he's the early bird with his gorgeous Fragmapedium Cedeniai. There are 29 species in this New World terrestrial or epiphytic genus found from mid-Central America to mid-South America. Several have been discovered just the last several years. These tropical American species were removed from Paphiopedalum in 1896 by Rolfe, who then created the genus Fragmapedium. He separated them out. They like shady, humid conditions, even water and fertilizer year round, and plenty of air circulation. Fragmapedium was first described in 1981 as Paphiopedalum Cedeniai. The species was found on the eastern slopes of the Andes, on cliff faces of riversides, and in wet montane forests. So that tells us it likes damp feet. The crimson flowers are about 3 inches wide, and Cedeniai is used extensively in breeding for its color and excellent shape. This has just beautiful symmetry. Tyler also shows us Cattleya, a miracle every day. This is a hybrid of Laelia brigeri by Frank Fordyce's SLC Circle of Life. And the result is this beautifully shaped, flat, round flower in fall colors with an amazing ruffled burgundy lip. The flower is about 3.5 inches, and it's a real stunner. These small to medium-sized Cattleya hybrids are wonderful windowsill growers with bright indirect light, intermediate or household kind of temperatures, but not outdoors. This is Tyler's Paphiopedal of Biolessons. It's found in New Guinea as a medium-sized, hot to cool growing species. It grows epiphytically or sometimes terrestrially in leaf mold and forest debris at elevations from about 650 to 3,900 feet in wet, shady places. So that's what it wants in cultivation too, wet and shady. We don't see violescens often in collections, but this flower has exceptional form and symmetry. Look at this. It's about 3.5 inches. The striking green pouch shows interesting darker green and pale burgundy tessellations. This is very, very interesting photo. Tom Pickford shows us 2 photos of his Cattleya bicolor 4N. 4N means that the chromosomes have been doubled, and that results in larger, stronger plants and flowers. This is a species native to Brazil, and it's now relatively rare in nature where it grows on almost vertical tree limbs. So because it's growing vertically, that means that it needs really good drainage around the roots. The sepals and petals vary in color from apple green to olive to this very rich bronze that we see here. Some with heavy spotting, some with just a few spots, as we can see here in the left-hand photo, just a few freckles on one petal up to the right. They all have in common the beautifully intensely rose-colored lip with no side lobes, which is interesting. The flowers are about 3 or 4 inches wide and they are fragrant. Nice, Tom. This is Tom's Masdevallia princeps. It's a vigorous grower. It's an epiphyte species from Peru. Masdevallia is a New World genus of about 600 species and are found from Mexico to the southern Andes. Most of them are cool to cold growers that do best with a fine bark mix in pots. They like low light, high humidity, and watering throughout the year, but be careful not to overwater. Tom grows this in his cool greenhouse in Bolinas, where the night temperatures are down to about 42 degrees. We only heat it to 42. The flowers are about 1.5 inches wide and up to 9 or 10 inches long, including the caudae or tails that you see at the tips of the 3 sepals. There are miniature petals and a lip in the yellow center of the flower. Can't even see them. This is Tom's I've tried to practice this. Lysuda muloa, red jewel. This is a complex hybrid of several generations of Lycaste hybrids, and it certainly gets its general shape from the Lycaste parentage. It also is influenced by others in its background, including Pseudomere Lycaste gigantea. Tom grows this in his cool greenhouse, but it certainly also would thrive in more intermediate temperatures. This is Tom's Cattleya Suncatcher Oktoberfest. This is a 1992 cross from Sea God Nursery. Those of you that remember, this was owned by Raymond Burr, Perry Mason, who grew his orchids on an island off the coast of Southern California. This is an unawarded cross of Cattleya dubiosa by Cattleya Edgard van Bell, and Tom's is a large, robust plant, as you can see here. It has 4 inflorescences and 10 or 11 big frilly flowers. This one's a little large for the average windowsill, but a lovely thing if you have room for it. It has beautifully saturated colors, just a drop dead gorgeous lip, and it is very, very fragrant. To me, it smells like a delicious spice blend that you put in on your stove during the holidays. Dale Martin shows us Paphiopedalum Rosslyn Pitts with a capital S, which is an interesting spelling. That's not a typo. And it has an FCC. And he sent an interesting story to go along with this. I'm quoting Dale here. Paphiopedalum Rosslyn is Godfrey by Ralphii, was registered in 1919 by H.T. Pitt, who was a member of the Royal Horticultural Society Orchid Committee from 1899 to 1927. He registered more than 100 hybrids, primarily in the Cattleya, Oncidium, and Paphiopedalum alliances. Rosslyn was named for the Rosslyn House at Stamford Hill, London, where Mr. Pitt lived. Eventually, Rosslyn made its way to the US. In 1965, Paph Rosslyn Pitts, capital S, received an AM AOS of 80 points when it was exhibited by Dr. and Mrs. William W. Wilson in Philadelphia. Then in 1968, Pitts was awarded an FCC AOS of 91 points when it was exhibited by Rod McClellan Company in Oakland, California. Dale's plant here is a division of the original Pitts cultivar, which came from the original cross that was registered in 1919 in England. So this is a very special plant. It's more than, has progeny for more than 100 years. Very cool. This is Dale's Paphiopedalum presidentially macabre, a very complex multifloral hybrid, just registered by Lahua Orchids in Hawaii last year, and it received its first AOS award earlier this year. These are very stately 5-inch flowers. They're displayed beautifully on a single inflorescence with lovely striping on the dorsal sepal and spotting on the petals. Paphs are great indoor growers for those of you that are growing on windowsills. Grow it in a plastic pot so it doesn't dry out too quickly, and use media that drains well but retains some moisture. So adding some perlite to the media will do the trick. And by the way, Dale Martin offers some great paphs for sale. This is Dale's Paphiopedalum QF Wainani, a cross of Paphloraine's Pride by Barbachuum. And what a spectacular color and glossy texture this hybrid has produced. This is a recent release from Quintal Farms, and it has not yet been awarded, so I don't know the measurements of the blossom. But the glossy lip and the hirsute or hairy edges that you see along the petals add interest to this luscious burgundy flower. This just looks juicy. Dale doesn't just grow paphs. This is his Dendrobium platycolon. This is a species from Borneo in the Philippines, where it grows as a warm-growing epiphyte in trees below 2,000 feet of elevation in dense, humid forests, so in moderate to low light, up in those treetops. It can bloom in the fall and again in the spring from the tips of flattened pseudobulbs, which you can see in the left-hand photo. And it blooms on both leafy and leafless canes. There are raised keels or ridges in the lip of this flower, and those act as directional aids to the pollinator, inviting him to come on inside these lovely creamy yellow flowers. Judy Carney shows us Certorchis chailuana. Certorchis is an African genus with about 18 species. Chailuana is from Central to West Africa at elevations from about 3,700 to 4,000 feet, where it's a warm to coolish growing medium-sized epiphyte. It needs cooler, dry winter rest to bloom this well. It also needs good humidity and bright light. The spidery flowers are about 1 inch across, and they're very sweetly fragrant. They turn from this creamy white to apricot as they age. And this is Judy's Certorchis praetermissa, another African species found mostly in woodlands from 1,500 to 6,000 feet of elevation. So it likes intermediate to cool temperatures and moderate light. We can see that it is monopodial, arising from a single stem with leaves that alternate from side to side. And the flower spike carries 2 rows of waxy white flowers that are nocturnally fragrant. They smell like lily of the valley, I'm told. This is Judy's Odontoglossum wyatttianum. Odontoglossums are found only in the Andes Mountains in South America, and this species is found in central Peru from 3,300 to 6,000 feet on the east slopes of the Andes. They grow on trees in the deep shade in heavily wooded hills where the canopy is thick, humidity is high, and heavy clouds, fog, and rain are common. So in cultivation, that means medium to low light and very good humidity. The flowers are unusual caramel color with a striking plum purple lip, and they're nicely held above the leaves, as we can see here. Judy grew this Cattleya dormaniana from a small seedling and is delighted to see it blooming. Cattleya is a South American genus, and this species is found in the state of Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, in humid cloud forests at elevations up to about 3,300 feet. The habitat is said to be one of the wettest places in Brazil. This often grows on dead, rotting wood of fallen trees, which are covered with moss and lichens. So this is probably not going to grow well outside of a humid greenhouse, but it grows beautifully in Judy's greenhouse. The copper-colored flowers are about 3 inches across with a rose to dark violet lip. Jan Anderson shows us Cattleya Dinard Blue Heaven. Jan says this is a remake and Mericlone of an older cross. She had one and lost it years ago, and then bought this one within the last 3 years because she really likes the dark, what we call blue in orchidom. To me, it's purple lip. The hybrid was first made in 1930 by Mr. Charles Worth, and we can see that it has 6 of the most beautiful Cattleya species in its background. This is the beautiful blooming with 6 or 7 flowers on 2 inflorescences. This is really lovely, Jan. This is Jan's Trichocentrum microchilum. Trichocentrum is in the Oncidium alliance, and microchilum means small-lipped. Jan says she divided a large plant last year, and one of her divisions bloomed with 2 spikes last month. This one just flowered a couple of weeks ago. The flowers last a long time. She says the contrast between the lime green pseudobulbs and the mahogany succulent-like leaves, which you can see on the left, make an interesting plant even when it's not in bloom. This is a species found in Mexico, Guatemala, and El Salvador, mostly growing terrestrially or in pockets of debris on lava flows. So it thrives with good drainage and very bright light. It needs very little water for several months in the winter. If you overwater it, it can be prone to rot. I've had that happen. So remember, we saw Jan and Fred's greenhouse under construction a few months ago. And on the left, we saw Bailey sitting proudly inside in July. Well, look at it now. This is fabulous and full greenhouse. And it's great to see Jan's collection under one roof. She has some wonderful mature plants, and we've enjoyed seeing many of them in bloom already. More to come. Looks like they've just been in there forever, doesn't it? Dave Hermeyer shows us Odontonia Nellie Eisler Swiss Beauty, and it is a beauty. Has huge cerise flowers for the size of the plant, and there are more buds on the backside of the plant that we can see as well. The hybrid genus is also known as Burigera. It's also known as Oncidiopsis, and it's a cross of Oncidium with Miltoniopsis. It's the Miltoniopsis that gives it that big flared, beautiful lip. This is a great windowsill grower, as it likes moderate to bright indirect light and household type temperatures. Love the color of this. This is Dave's Cattleya Periwinkle Poetry, a cross of Cattleya lodogezii and Cattleya Blue and Gold, made by Santa Barbara Orchid Estate in 2007. It's never been awarded. Dave's flowers have a lovely full shape and, of course, that periwinkle color with the deep purple lips surrounding the gold interior. It's growing nicely on, mounted on a piece of branch, so the roots can dry between waterings, which is critical. This is Dave's beautifully grown Maxillaria, and he says it is an unnamed mini Picta type, Picta meaning painted or colored. Maxillary is a large genus spread throughout the tropical and subtropical Americas. Picta is a warm to cool growing epiphyte from Brazil with 2-inch flowers. And the Maxillarys are really good windowsill plants because they're robust growers, they're often fragrant, they're very rewarding. And they're all sizes and shapes to choose from in the Maxillaria genus. Tanya Lamb shows us Holcoglossum campbellianum, a species from Southeast Asia, first discovered in Burma. Plants sometimes grow on trees in partial shade, but they're more often found on rocks, frequently in full sun at 4,000 to 5,000 feet. So these lovely vanda-like orchids are best grown in bright light, and they're often mounted to ensure the roots dry out between waterings. The flowers are fragrant. They're about 2 inches or more across, with a beautiful contrast between the white sepals and petals and the fuchsia colored lip. This is Tanya's Aranthes ramosa. Aranthes is an African genus, and this species is from Madagascar, where it grows in mossy forests about 4,600 feet. They prefer shady, humid, well-watered conditions and balanced fertilizer all year round. The inflorescences can take months to form, if those of you that are growing them will know. And the inflorescences should not be removed till it's obvious that they're dead, as they can rebloom off the same spike for several seasons. Plants are most often grown in baskets to accommodate the long pendant inflorescences that can reach 3 feet or longer. This apple green flower is about 2 inches with a short 1-inch spur or nectary visible below the flower here. We don't often see these in collections. I just purchased 4 Aranthi species from Louisiana Orchid Collection, and I'm anxiously awaiting their arrival from Madagascar. And Tanya's ring Cattleyanthe Blue Ocean. This is a complex hybrid whose parentage is about 2/3 Cattleya boringiana, 1/4 labiata, with some Laelia tenebrosa and Rhyncholaelia digbyana added into the mix. These complex hybrids have been created to grow and flower well for the hobbyist grower on a windowsill or in a greenhouse with bright indirect light, regular watering and feeding while it's actively growing, and less water from about now till Valentine's Day. That's, as Susan said earlier, Tom Perliti always describes why the winter rest period is Halloween to Valentine's Day. I think that makes it easy to remember. The lip on this flower is very striking and the petals are round and full. It's very lovely. And this is Tanya's spectacularly bloomed Cattleya Tanya Lamb. There's a great backstory on this. I'm going to read it to you. Cattleya Tanya Lamb. Tanya brought this plant to a local show, but didn't enter it for judging. The judges selected it and recommended that Tanya register it. Tanya was surprised to learn that she did not have to be a hybridizer to register an orchid with the Royal Horticultural Society. Bud Seagraves was a great orchid friend who gave Tanya the plant about 20 years ago. He passed away in 2008 at age 84, and Tanya was able to honor him in 2015 when this plant was awarded an HCC with 84 flowers on 10 inflorescences. Cattleya Tanya Lamb is a long-lasting Cattleya that blooms between Halloween to early December. This classy flower represents Tanya well with a beautifully light fragrance and velvety pink color. So applause for that. Very nice, Tanya. Thank you for sharing that. Susan Anderson shows us Dendrobium Smiley Eye. Maybe it's Smiley Eye, but I like to say Smiley Eye. Dendrobium is the second largest genus after Bulbophyllum. Dendrobium has over 1,200 species ranging through all parts of Asia and the Pacific. And Dendrobium is the second most common orchid genus in cultivation after Cattleyas. Susan grows a lot of them really well in her intermediate greenhouse in Bolinas, and she's going to show us 3 interesting species tonight. Dendrobium Smiley Eye is a species from Southeast Australia and Papua New Guinea, where it's known as the bottlebrush orchid. You can see why. It's an epiphyte growing on tree trunks and on tree ferns, where bark and leaves have accumulated and have composted to form kind of a coarse soil for them to thrive in. It's found at low elevations, and it forms these hyacinth-like clusters of flowers, each flower being about 1/2 inch wide. The pink pedicels or individual flower stems are a beautiful contrast to the white and dark green flowers. This is really an unusual flower. This is Susan's Dendrobium Anae, a species from Java and Sumatra. And Susan's plant was awarded a certificate of horticultural merit in 2017 when she named the clone Bailey's Best in honor of her golden retriever. May he rest in peace. The inflorescence arises at the tip of older leafless canes, and the 3-inch flowers are bright white with magenta blotches at the tips of the petals and at the apex of the lip. It has a lovely crystalline texture, which you can't really see in this photo, but you can see that Susan is growing it in her greenhouse, surrounded by many other beauties. And this is Susan's Dendrobium falciparum. This is a species indigenous to Sulawesi, which is one of the Indonesian islands. The flowers are the most curious coral salmon color, and they rise along leafless canes, which are over 2 feet tall. In nature, they grow on old mangroves and trees in littoral woodlands and along riverbeds, lakesides, and floodplains at elevations to about 1,200 feet. So they're warm to intermediate growers, which require high humidity to grow as well as Susan's does in her greenhouse. It does this show for her every year. This is Susan's Dendrochilum species. There are 284 epiphytic and lithophytic species in the genus Dendrochilum, and they're often difficult to tell apart. They typically have creeping rhizomes, so they readily grow into specimen-sized plants. and they bloom on grass-like inflorescences, thin inflorescences, which arise from the center leaf of emerging growths. And then the inflorescence descends into a pendulous, many-flowered stem with 2 ranks of small, often fragrant flowers. Their ranges from Myanmar to the Philippines. They like to be moist year-round. Don't let them dry out. Dendrochilums are great, very rewarding windowsill candidates for you. Stuart Menaker shows us Epidendrum Cockyii. These interesting 2-inch waxy burgundy flowers are a species from Peru and Ecuador, first identified in 1999. There's virtually no information published on them yet, but Dennis Olivas brought 3 of these for judging at Speaker's Day in Sacramento a couple of years ago, and they were awarded with great awe. Nobody had seen them before. They're even more intriguing in person, but this is a great photograph. This is Stuart's Paphiopedalum delenatii, which is one of my favorite paphs and which I find difficult to grow well. It's a species from Vietnam and Yunnan, China, where it grows as a terrestrial or lithophytic orchid, lithophytic meaning growing on rocks. It grows in lowland forests or highland cloud forests on soils rich in silicates or acidic, mossy soils and crevasses on eastern or southern facing slopes above rivers and streams, and partial shade at elevations up to 1,500 meters. So the key things there is that it's small. It's a windowsill sized plant, warm to cool growing, needs good humidity, and it's just charming. The flowers are about 3 to 4 inches. This is Stewart's Pleurothallus ruberima. Pleurothallus is the largest New World genus found in the tropical and subtropical Americas. Ruberima is a species found from Colombia to Venezuela in cloud forests, so it prefers cool, damp conditions. The name ruberina refers to rubrum, the brick red color of the flower. Flower is about 1/2 inch wide and about 3 inches long. And as the case with most Pleurothallus, the flower stem arises from near the base, the center base of the leaf itself. This is Stewart's Laelia elorii, a species from the Brazilian coastal mountains at low elevations. They were just discovered in the late 1960s, but have not been seen in their habitat for many years and may be extinct in the wild as the land is being destroyed rapidly for huge cocoa plantations. Fortunately, they persist in many collections and they are just charming. These are miniatures. The inflorescence arises from the center of a newly forming pseudobulb, and the plant is compact with no more than 3 or 4 inches tall. So the flowers are about 2 inches, and that's large relative to the size of the plant. The flowers are bell-shaped. This is a fully opened bloom. And isn't it just adorable? Can you tell I love this little gem? I've purchased several of these from AWZ Orchids and from Peter T. Lynn with good results from both potted and mounted. Intermediate temps are best because they are low elevation plants and they need just bright indirect light. Roberta Fox shows us Dendrobium Smiley Eye. We saw Susan Anderson's a few slides ago. It's native to Papua New Guinea and Queensland, Australia, in tropical low elevation. So Roberta grows it in her greenhouse where it's warmer than outdoors on her patio in Costa Mesa. It blooms on the bare canes of the prior year. She says it appears to bloom only once on a cane, with flowers coming from the top of the cane. The close-up on the left shows that the flowers are non-resupinate, which means that the lip is at the top or kind of upside down compared to most orchids which have the lip at the bottom of the flower. This is Roberto's Maxillary Scleriformis, native to Panama at elevations from 3,300 to 4,300 feet. This would imply that it can grow on the cool side, and Andy Phillips of Andy's Orchids grows it outdoors in his nursery in Encinitas, California. However, Roberta says she's lost several to crown rot over the winter, so now she's moving them into her greenhouse for the winter. She's tried growing it in the greenhouse full-time, but it blooms much better grown outside much of the year. It must stay damp, even wet. It takes very poorly to drying out. This is worth the effort because the contrast between the pink flowers and the dark green foliage is really dramatic. It typically blooms at least twice a year with this lovely blush of pink flowers. This is Roberta Zygopetalum maxillary, a species native to Brazil, northeast Argentina, and Paraguay. It grows at elevations around 4,300 in cool mountain rainforests. Its growth habit is rambling. Roberta grows it in a basket, and it tends to climb out of the basket. She grows it outdoors all year round in coastal Southern California. Your zygos should be starting to spike right about now if they have enough light, and the operative word with zygos is purple. Zygos are great windowsill candidates or outdoors in the Bay Area most of the year, and then indoors during the rainy season. You could probably leave them outdoors temperature-wise all year, but the leaves will get a lot of black spots if you leave them outdoors in the cool, damp weather. K. Klum shows us Tridactyl Tricuspids. This is an African species which is growing mounted on tree fern in the intermediate greenhouse. The flowers are a little bigger than a ½ inch, and it's nocturnally fragrant, indicating that it's moth pollinated. The genus name Tridactyl means the lip has a 3-pronged end from dactos, from the finger, Greek for finger. And the species name Tricuspids means pretty much the same thing. This is a nice blooming of it with 3 inflorescences. And Case Mysticidum gracile. We don't need a ruler to see how tiny this plant is. It's growing on a champagne cork. This is a species from Madagascar in Africa, and it's also growing in the intermediate greenhouse. It's mostly leafless, as you can see, which means that it photosynthesizes through its roots. And that means the roots must be exposed to the air. It cannot be in a pot. It must be mounted like this. And Case Odontoglossum keto. This is a primary hybrid of Odont cristatellum, which is also known as Oncidium leymanii, crossed with Odont navium. Both parents are from high elevations in the Andes in Colombia, Peru, and Venezuela. So Kay has this growing in the cool greenhouse where it's thriving mounted, as we can see. I'm growing mine potted in fine orchiata, and mine's in bloom now too, in my cool greenhouse. Kay's done a great job photographing the fringed lip on the right. And Kay's Gastrochylis Calciularis. This is a species found at a wide range of elevations in India, Southeast Asia, and in the Himalayas, and the Philippines. It's a monopodial epiphyte, and Calciularis is the type species for this genus of about 61 species. Calciularis means it is shaped like a small shoe, which if we squint, we can sort of see in the shape of the lip. The flowers are about 3/4 of an inch. They're waxy, long lasting, and they're lightly fragrant. This little orchid, these little Gastrochylis are just charming. Jennifer Pulaka shows us Glycocentrone Marilliana. This is a genus of just 5 epiphytic species, and this blue beauty, Marilliana, is endemic to Sabah, Borneo. It grows in the crowns of large mossy trees in forests at elevations of 3,500 to 9,000 feet in bright filtered light, so cool temperatures. The leaves are terete and leathery, and the blue flowers are about ½ an inch, produced in clusters on an arching inflorescence. Very unusual. This is Jen's Cattleya Minerva, a lovely primary hybrid of Cattleya Perenniae by Cattleya Lawrenceana. This is an old cross made in 1890, but it's never been awarded in the US. Looks to me like it might be time to take this to the judging table for a closer look. It's a beautiful color. Jen also shows us Sologeny massagiana, which the taxonomists have now renamed Solanitomentosa. It's a species from the mountainous regions of Java and Sumatra, where it's usually found as an epiphyte in dark, shady forests. So in situ, it is cool growing, and the long pendant inflorescences rises from the base of the pseudobulb after new leaves have just emerged. The flowers are fragrant, not very long lasting, maybe 10 days, and they're characterized by several wavy, warty keels or ridges in the lip that you can see in the photo here. Sologenies are a very interesting genus and rewarding in any collection. This is Jen's Leliocattleya Helen Christie, and I believe the clonal name Puesta del Sol translates as something like putting the sun. And there is the sunny spot in the center of the lip. This is a complex hybrid with large, round, striking flowers. Steve Lipson shows us his Fragmapedium flavum. It's called flavum. Steve says this is a cross of Bessii form flavum green gold by Schlemiei Cali, which he got from Tom Kalina at Fox Valley Orchids. So flavum means yellow, and the breeder may have been hoping for a yellow form here. This is not obviously yellow, but it's a gorgeous first blooming of the seedling with a single growth having about a 10-inch leaf spread. The flower is 2.5 inches across and it stands about 8 inches above the medium. Just has really nice symmetry, Steve. This is Steve's Paphiopedal of Ice, which he got from Dave Sorokowski of Path Paradise up in Lincoln, where Dave grows with Alan Koch. Dave Sorokowski just registered this complex hybrid in 2018, and it's not yet been awarded. Steve says his flower is about 2 3/4 inches across with a second flower in bud form, as we can see here. This is very nicely grown. And this is Steve's Paphiopedalum Charlesworthii. This is a species from Burma, which is now called Myanmar, I believe, and also from Thailand. It's one of the most awarded PAF species with 68 awards in the US alone, 170 awards worldwide. It's also used extensively in breeding with over 300 first-generation offspring. What that means is that Charlesworthii was either the seed parent or the pollen parent of the offspring, as opposed to being just a grandparent used in a hybrid background. So Steve's is considered a species because it's not hybridized with a different PAF, but there's considerable, quote, line breeding within a species to improve characteristics, size, color, etc., as you can see from Steve's specific information bottom left. This was provided by Woodstream Orchids, where he bought it. This is a beautiful first bloom seedling. And our president, Jeff Harris, shows us Fragmapedium Cedeniai, a primary hybrid of Paphiopedal by Longifolium. This is a beautifully grown plant with 3 inflorescences, which will bloom successively, as we can see the bud in the close-up photo on the right. Frags can be successfully grown in your home in a plastic pot so they don't dry out too quickly, with media that drains well but retains moisture. Do not allow mature frags to dry out between waterings. Many of them enjoy actually sitting in a shallow tray of water with pebbles to increase humidity, and they need just medium light. This is lovely. This is Jeff Orangus Biloba, Big Ben. This is a charming little West African native found up to 2,300 feet in shade to dappled light, so it prefers intermediate to warm temperatures, light shade, good humidity. It can be grown in a pot or a bark mix or mounted on cork or tree fern and watered year round. The flowers cascade on a slightly pendant inflorescence. Flowers are about 2 inches, bright white with an apricot colored spur, which we can't see in these photos, but there's a light blush of apricot on the tips of the sepals and petals. This is a great small orchid for any collection. Orangus Biloba. This is my Cochleota mixtura, a recently discovered species in 2001 by Stig Dahlstrom. Of course, the taxonomists couldn't leave it alone, so in 2012 they lumped it into Odontoglossum. It grows in Peru and Bolivia near Cochabamba, in cool, wet cloud forests at elevations of 1,800 to 2,600 feet. I grow it mounted in my cool greenhouse, which goes down to about 42 degrees these nights, and it's mounted on a cork slab where it gets bright indirect light, and I give it a fairly dry winter rest. And my Cymbidium Erythrostylum. This is a species from Vietnam at about 5,000 feet of elevation. I think it's one of the loveliest Cymbidium species. The sepals and petals are crepe papery white, almost translucent, and the yellow throat is striped with intense red-purple lines. This is a small Cymbidium, and it grows in my cool greenhouse, but it will probably do just fine outdoors in the Bay Area. I give it almost no water for several months in winter. I bought this from Carter and Holmes in South Carolina in 2015. I've divided it a couple of times. It's very vigorous. This is my Monierara Millennium Magic Witchcraft, which received an FCC in Hawaii in 2013. It's a complex catasetum hybrid, which I also bought from Carter and Holmes in South Carolina online. The great thing about catasetums is that they go completely deciduous and dormant in the winter soon, and they want 0 water. So you can put them away on a high shelf and forget about them for about 5 months. This is as black a flower as I have seen, just really is intriguing to me. And next, of course, is the Pet Parade, tonight provided by Jen Poulakis. So here, these are Jen's 2 lovely kitties, Chloe guarding the Cattleya on the left and Maui climbing the Sologeny on the right. Jen says that Chloe is a 5-year-old tabby and Maui is the new addition to Jen's family. He's very affectionate and active. He was born on July 16th and he came to live with Jen when he was about 12 weeks old. There's so many cat toys for him to choose from, but of course he can't resist an orchid root or leaf to play with. The first 3 days, Jen kept the cat separated. The next 5 days, Chloe hissed and growled at Maui. Once the hissing subsided, they slowly started to play. They're not best friends yet, but Jen's fingers are crossed. So thanks to everyone for great photos again tonight. See you after Thanksgiving. And these are just acknowledging some of the source material I use each month. Thank you.
Great job, Lynn.
Thank you.
Really beautiful.
Our members just grow beautiful things. I wish a few more members would stop being shy and send some photos.
All right. Can you hear us online? We're about to start the awards.
Sorta, kinda.
Yes.
Okay. Let's see. How do we do this? Go.
That's a little better.
Wait. Hold on. Start video. Owl. Where's the video?
So should I introduce the friend in your hand first?
Sure.
Or should we leave us to the last?
Okay.
I have 3 awards tonight. I guess I'll introduce the one in Ken's hands first because he's like having issues. This is a species, Cymbidium Erythrostylum. It has 50 spikes. Wow. And it's all around, and it's a happy flag. And
1.6 meters
CC,
wide.
yeah, CC of 92. So that's Kent's plant.
Ah, very nice, Ken.
And his question is, should he grow it up even bigger or break it up? So, okay, we're done with this one.
Can you see it online?
So can you see it online?
You got it?
You got a name for it?
Yeah, it's Dan White Oak.
Can't hear you.
White Oak. White Oak. Came from the White Oak Nursery.
Yeah.
Can you step forward towards? Does that help?
Okay. Can
Oh,
you
that's
guys see it?
lovely. Let's see. Right.
That's somebody who's on the Zoom call.
Right.
Does that help? No.
Okay.
How big is your pot?
Can we go
20
to,
centimeters. Next.
so next,
Thank you. Sorry.
next one is, it's basically Pohoon, which is a Fordyce Fantasy by Seagull's Laura Hall. And it's a HCC of 79 and belongs to Jacob.
79.
He is Mr. 79, just in case.
Oh, got it.
We named him that over the years. He took it over from Tom Perletti. Yeah, Tom Perletti was the king of 79 for a while.
You should come back, so I can pass out the game again.
Right. So can we all, yeah, oh, they see it. Great. Okay, where's the camera? And the third award,
Okay, that's good. You're on the screen.
that's good. Okay, got it.
Nobody said anything, how cute my ears are.
Next.
Okay, thank you.
And the third award is, used to be a SLC, Dream Circle. This is one of the original plants that Frank Fordyce made in his greenhouse. So this one is Gracie, and it's AM of 82, 83, 84, sorry, AM of 84. So, and that's my plant.
All right.
Yeah.
Keep it in the family.
Keep it in the family, and Gracie is my dog daughter.
And the other one is also for nice across.
Right,
I got from
the
him,
poem is
I don't know,
also.
15 years ago.
So for those of you who have originally Frank Fordyce seedlings, there's still great ones out there. Okay?
Yep.
Thank you. Yes?
Thank you. Thank you, thank you. All right, we're tweaking logistics as we go. Hopefully it's working better. So without further ado, if you need a break, you use the restroom, there's food, a little bit of drink in the back. Thank you to Andrea for the wonderful cookies. And don't forget to buy raffle tickets for the plants at with stage. So we're going to transition to Gary Meyer. He's going to talk to us about. I'm not going to read the whole introduction. I'm going to just go through it. Okay. So now logistically,
Just stand there and do your thing from there.
put this here. Or
No, please don't use that one. Give them the wireless, because this is way too directional. That one sucks as this kind of mic.
Okay.
Just plug this, hook it onto the shirt any old place and throw it in the pocket.
Okay, everybody. We have a raffle for you on Zoom. You just have to put your name in the chat and you will be entered. We need 10 participants. Only 3 people have submitted their name. And this is for a gift certificate for $20 to Tiny Jungle. And you have to use it before December 31st. Oh, here we go. We got more names. Keep them coming. Yes. Perfect. Great. Excellent. Okay. We're going to start soon. Keep them coming.
Thank you, Mishi.
Tom, you're muted.
Is there any sound?
Now there is.
No, I'm talking about from the presentation.
Oh,
No, we can hear you.
I'm going to go back to mute.
All right, can everyone online hear me?
Now we can.
So I think we got the technology set up here and the room's dark. So my name is Gary Meyer. I'm actually a member of the society, although you don't see me very much because I kind of travel a lot. And I'm going to talk to you a lot about my travels today. And my travels heavily focus on trying to study Draculas in the wild. But I'm going to give you an overview of the genus and the history of the genus and things that I've learned about conservation and impact of humans on orchids in the wild from my travels. But the keyboard is not responding to me. So,
Well, they're having trouble hearing. Let's see. Is this muted? No. It sounds like it's on to me. Yeah? Oh.
yeah, the slides are, oh, okay, I'm used to using. Okay, so move this around.
You can now this is because of now.
Okay, now it's working. All right, so I'm going to give you a history of the genus Dracula and walk you through where Draculas live in the world and show you some different examples of them. And then most of the talk is going to be on my research on Draculas, both a little bit in the laboratory, but mostly on my travels throughout Colombia and Ecuador to study the plants in the wild. So Dracula starts with this guy back in the 1400s. This
Vlad the Impaler.
Yes, Vlad III of Wallachia, also known as Vlad Tepes or Vlad the Impaler, and this is one of history's great genocidal maniacs. He killed hundreds of thousands of people, his own citizens included, by driving wooden stakes through their anuses up through their mouths, and then leaving the bodies to hang outside the cities and rot, so that anybody who was walking by would know what would happen if you crossed him. He's the first person in history that we know of who took on the name Dracula. His father referred to himself as the dragon or Draco, and so Vlad Tepes referred to himself as the son of the dragon, ergo Dracula. And Dracula is a diminutive form of Draco. He, despite being a genocidal maniac, was not a vampire. We associate vampires with the name Dracula in 1897 with the publication of Bram Stoker's novel, Dracula.
And this is the first and seminal association of vampires with the name Dracula and also with Transylvania. We don't know why Bram Stoker chose the name Dracula for his vampire, but when it comes to Transylvania, at the time, Bram Stoker was an expert by nature of being British, and he decided that the two worst places in the world were Germany and Transylvania. And he was trying to decide which place to make the home of his Dracula character, and eventually settled on Transylvania. So up to this point, there were vampire legends in cultures all over the world throughout history, but this is the first time that we associate vampires with the name Dracula. Around the same time in the 1800s, we have the Victorian orchid craze going on, where we have all these Europeans traveling around South America, collecting plants, sending them on ships back to England or to Germany to get described. And in 1872, Benedict Rezel had collected this thing in Colombia near Cali and sent it back to Europe, where Reichenbach described it as Masdevallia chimera. And anything that was triangular shaped like this was being called a Masdevallia back in the 1800s. And in fact, for the next century, anything that we now know as a Dracula that was being discovered was described originally as Masdevallia. In 1978, Carlisle Luer, who was doing taxonomy work on all the pleurothalids, separated out these unique Masdevallias that used to be called section Saculabiatae into Dracula. And he named the genus Dracula because he felt that the flowers looked like little dragons. The main distinction, there are a number of distinctions between Draculas and Masdevallias, but the most obvious is that Draculas have a very profound lip, and Masdevallias have very tiny lips. And this lip, I'll talk a little bit more down the road, is thought to resemble a fungus and to promote pollination by insects that are looking to do things on fungus. So when Luer created the genus Dracula, there were about 50 known species. And since Luer started working on the genus grew to over 120 species. So we are definitely living in the era of Dracula right now. And new species continue to be described. And I'll talk about that at the very end of the talk. But one of the species he named was Dracula latepis to close the loop on the history of where we had this name come from. Dracula habitat, this is what it looks like. It's cloud forest, and this determines how you have to grow them. It's shady, wet, cool, and breezy. Draculas are almost always in very dark places in the forest, tons of humidity, but tons of airflow. Honestly, the reason I put up with the rents here in San Francisco is because it's the best place in the United States to be growing these plants. Otherwise, I wish I grew angraecums or something and could move to Texas or Arizona, but these are the plants I love, so I stay here. This is what the habitat looks like. For the most part, they're often growing on embankments that are very wet with lots of rotting material around the roots. They grow on twigs covered with moss deep in the forest or on tree trunks. Generally not very high, they're almost always below 12 feet. But there are some very unusual habitats that I've observed in the wild, and I used to tell people that I only ever find Draculas growing in very, very wet environments that wet all the time. And here we have an example of Draculas growing hydroponically. This is a rock wall, and you can see the exposed roots. There is absolutely no material around these roots, and there's just water trickling over them, and the plants are doing just fine. This Dracula is growing in a dry forest. And when I was there, it was completely dusty. The leaves were all crunchy under my feet, and there was nothing wet at all. And this plant was doing just fine as well. There are some Draculas that tend to bloom in a flush, and other Draculas that bloom successively and can bloom for over a year on the same spike. And I tend to find that the flush bloomers are in these dry forests more, where there's probably a rainy season and a dry season. And so that's dictating that they're going to bloom at only a certain time during the year. Most of the time, Draculas are in very, very dark environments, but I have found them growing out in what is nearly full sun. These are Dracula chimeras that are growing on this embankment out here where there's no protection, but they're very stunted. They don't like the sunlight. They're growing okay, but compared to the plants that were actually in the forest, these were about a third of the leaf size, so not the ideal for these plants. I'm going to walk you through now an atlas of where Draculas are from. They're, like all pleurothalids, they're from the New World. And the northernmost Draculas are in Central America. There's 1 to 2 species that just barely make it into Mexico and Guatemala. Then down in Costa Rica and Panama, there's about 6 to 8 species. And I hyphenate this because the distinctions between Dracula species are very hard to defend sometimes. So there are a lot of things that are named species that in the wild, it's very, very hard to draw the line between one and their nearest cousin. Dracula stopped in central Peru. Up to this point, there are Draculas, but south of here there aren't. And that's curious because there are tons of Masdevallias south of here. Masdevallia ricciana is, of course, from the Machu Picchu area. All of the really wonderful stripy Masdevallias like Chaparensis and Jungicensis that we use in hybridization, those come from Bolivia. But for some mysterious reason, Dracula stops right there. And we've got 6 known species from Peru. And really the bulk of the genus is in Colombia and Ecuador, and that's where I spend most of my travel time, where there's about 100+ species. So looking at the Central American Draculas, the northernmost Dracula is Dracula pusilla, and pusilla is Latin for not very much. And this flower is not very much, but it does bloom in a flush and usually puts out quite a few flowers at a time. So it makes up an abundance for its smallness. Further down in Costa Rica and Panama, we get a little more diversity of Draculas. There's what I would call the erythrochaete complex because there's a lot of overlap in these. There's a cuppier form called Dracula Calciularis, a flatter form Astuta, a very small flowered one, Ripleyana, that was named for Harold Ripley, who was a member of the San Francisco Society back in the 70s and 80s. So we mentioned earlier during the show and tell the Darien Gap. I think it was Jeff who mentioned that. This is the Darien Gap right here. And it is very inhospitable to Draculas. I've been there. It is very, very hot and muggy and wet. And in fact, I've been on top of this little tiny mountain here, hiked up there for 6 days because it's an important bird watching site. And the guide that I was with said that he's seen Draculas up there. He had a lot of problem with truth, so I don't know if I would believe him. I think it was an attempt to get me to go back and spend another 6 days of money with him. But in general, the Draculas that are in Central America have no similarity to the Draculas in South America. And there's only one species that has somehow managed to cross this Darien Gap, and that's Dracula Vespertellio. This is the most widespread Dracula. It has been found in Nicaragua all the way down to Ecuador. And this is a pretty good plant to grow if you have more of an intermediate temperature collection. I actually have a little trouble with it in my greenhouse in Pacifica because it tends to be too cool for this species. But it is possible that this thing might exist on that mountain that I was on, right on the Darien Gap border of Colombia there. I'm going to jump down to Peru, where there's also less diversity. For 20 years, we thought that this was the only Dracula from Peru, Dracula Genetii. It was named after the original owner of J&L Orchids. J&L stood for Janet and Lee Kuhn. But over the past 2 decades, more Draculas have been found in Peru. And the most interesting one that's been found in Peru is Dracula Smiley Eye. This is really adorable, cute white puffball. It has a kind of a weird feature where the dorsal tail is really short and the lateral tails are really, really long. So it's the only Dracula that's got an asymmetry like that. And it's a very cooperative grower. It does well in intermediate temperatures. Peru Flora is the main distributor of this. So I don't know if they're coming to the show in February, but these sell out before the show even opens. So if you're interested in growing this, I'm sure to show up on setup day and nab a plant before anyone else does. Now I'm going to divide the Andes up into the sides because things are different depending on which side you're on in the Andes. So on that east slope of Ecuador, we have things like Dracula Vespertellio. This is a warmer growing species, better for a mixed collection. Dracula Simia, which is the only one that I would call the monkey orchid, Simia means monkey. Further up in Colombia, the Andes divide into three chains. There's what we call the Eastern Cordillera, Central Cordillera, and Western Cordillera. And just like the east slope in Ecuador, the Eastern Cordillera does not have a lot of diversity. Around Bogota, there are these things, Dracula Venecia and Foliodites. They're very, very similar. Again, showing you what I was talking about, that in the wild, it's hard to separate these species that have been named XC2. Dracula Diabola, named for the devil, is also from north of Bogota. Dracula orientalis is the easternmost Dracula. It's from right around here, right on the border with Venezuela. And there's not any records of Draculas from Venezuela, but I wouldn't be surprised if this thing does exist in Venezuela. Jumping back down to Ecuador then, now we're gonna go up the west slope, which is where there's a lot more diversity of the species. So around Cuenca, where Equihenra is based, we have Dracula Cordoba. This is a pretty good intermediate growing species. Dracula mopsis, this is probably the warmest growing of all the species, and it grows well in cool temperatures too. It has a really broad tolerance for temperature, but it doesn't look like much. Dracula Wardii, if you want to grow with the big hairy looking Draculas and you have an intermediate growing environment, this is probably the best one for you. Most of the big flower Draculas really need cool temperatures and high humidity, but this one is more warmth tolerant. Now moving up towards Quito, we have Dracula Calciularis. It doesn't look like a Dracula from the side, but if you look at it inside, it definitely has all the Dracula parts. And then Dracula Vampira, the largest of the genus, probably the most emblematic of the genus. There's one plant on the Raffle table I know of, but this is pretty stunning black and white flower. The border between Ecuador and Colombia is where the most diversity is in the entire genus. And we have things like Dracula, what we now call Fuliginosa, used to be known as Radiella, Dracula gigas, and this can have a wide variety of color forms, yellow, darker red. Dracula polyphemus, one of my favorites. Moving up to the Cali area in Colombia, this is where Orchidius del Valle is based. And from here you have Dracula reticulosa, Dracula Maliae, and then this is Dracula Chimera. It was originally collected around Cali, and this is right up the road from Andrea Neeson's nursery. The forests above her nursery are full of Dracula Chimeras. And finally, the northern part of both the central and western Cordillera near Medellin, Colombia. This is where I spend most of my time. I live there about 3 months per year. And here you can find Dracula Bella, Dracula Gorgona, and Dracula Reslii is one of the most stunning in the genus. And it has this velvety texture because every single one of the hairs, if you look at it with a microscope, has a little star at the tip of that. And John Leathers made probably the most famous Dracula cross, Dracula Raven, which was a cross between Reslii and Vampira. And it produces these large, flat, almost completely black flowers. So that's a walk through what the plants look like. And now I'm going to take you through my various studies on the plants. A little bit of laboratory work, but more studies of the plants in the wild and how human interests and politics around land usage and orchid collection are impacting the plants in the wild. And a lot of what I say is true for anything that's a cloud forest plant. Cloud forests are particularly endangered forest environments within the Andes. So a little bit on taxonomy. This is what Lure originally did. His taxonomy work was the way we always did it. It was looking at the plants and saying, well, these features are kind of similar to this plant, so I'm going to put them together in a group. And taxonomy is really just, a way for us to be able to communicate about the plants. And so he came up with this system. But in the 90s, we started moving more towards molecular taxonomy, using the actual genome of the plants to try to link them together evolutionarily instead of just by looking at what their features look like. And back in 2005, I went to a scientific conference held at Ecuador for Andean orchids, and I met this guy, this is Ken Cameron, who was at the New York Botanical Garden at the time, and now he's the herbarium director at the University of Wisconsin. And we sat together at lunch, and I'm a scientist by training, and I was doing a postdoc here at UCSF, and he said, if you've got the actual laboratory skills that you do and you have access to all the plants you have access to, why don't we do the molecular taxonomy on the genus Dracula? I don't think he really believed that I was going to come, but next summer I showed up in his lab and started a multi-year project where I would off and on go to his laboratory to DNA extractions and amplifications on that genus Dracula. And you may have seen these things in various orchid talks. These are called platograms. This is an example of what comes out from that kind of analysis. And some of what we were identified originally just through morphology was really quite true. The good news is that everything that we know is a Dracula, except for one species, is on this branch, which means we don't have to rename the genus or split it up or lump it. Everything that we recognize as a Dracula stays as a Dracula. Lure had identified some very primitive Draculas, and they separate out nicely. He had this group called Dodsonias, and they are on a branch all by themselves. He created this group called Costates, all on a group by themselves. These all have very distinctive wings on the ovaries, but then you have this up here. And this is completely uninterpretable, and this is the result of back in the day when we were doing this work, looking at too small a component of the genome to be able to separate this. And this is true of most portothallus. They're very recently evolved plants. The Andes are a hotbed of evolution and very quickly. So in order to resolve this, it's, nowadays you can do work on the entire genome relatively cheaply, but not cheap enough that I'm going to finance it myself. So this is kind of where our research ended. I'm going to talk a little bit about pollination. Like I indicated, that lip is very similar to all these little funguses that you see in the wild in the cloud forest. So it was thought that insects are coming to the lip here thinking that it's a fungus, and in fact there's been work done to show that Draculas emit fungal odors. And in the wild, when I find Draculas, I always find all kinds of bugs crawling around in the lips, so they're very, very good at attracting insects into their pollination mechanism. But the research to date has shown that Dracula pollinators are not very specific to a species. And we've got this notion going all the way back to Darwin and Great Paphiopedal that orchids evolved a very close relationship with one single pollinator, and every single orchid has its own unique pollinator. And that's really not the rule, that's the exception. And in the wild, the insects are a lot more varied that will come and pollinate the plants. And if you take Draculas from different areas and put them together in a greenhouse, just like has been done for decades in Latin America, eventually you start to produce lots and lots and lots of Dracula hybrids spontaneously, because you've got species that would never be living together now in close approximation, and insects that don't really see the difference between the plants. So Lure started naming species in the 80s from these greenhouses in Colombia, And over time, he started to figure out that these things probably are not actual species, they're probably hybrids that arose in the greenhouses. And part of my DNA analyses was able to establish that some of these are in fact hybrids. This one, Dracula circi, never been seen in the wild. Dracula vinifica, never from the wild. But some of the things that he didn't suspect were hybrids turned out to be hybrids too. This is Dracula Calciularis. Dracula Cymbidium is a hybrid that arose at the Equihenera collection. And then this is my favorite of the named hybrids, Dracula incognita. One parent grows up and one parent grows its spikes out the side. And this hybrid grows spikes in both directions at the same time. So you get the best of both parents' characteristics. What Luer didn't quite understand at the time was the extent to which hybridization is happening naturally in the wild. And my studies really uncovered in the DNA that there's a lot of natural hybridization. He suspected that this thing, Dracula pileus, might be a natural hybrid between Chimera and Bella. But my DNA studies found that this was a hybrid after these. It was collected with reticulosa and a very weird looking thing called Encelita. And if you saw both of those flowers and then this thing, you'd clearly be able to tell that this is a love child of those two things. This is a very pretty natural hybrid, Dracula Cordoba. I'm going to skip over this, but the only thing that got kicked out of the genus was this thing, Dracula xenos. It's a very, very weird plant, and xenos means weird. We gave it the name xenos because it's weird. And this thing is sterile. No one has ever found pollinia on it, which is a pretty good indication that this is probably a hybrid. And in fact, it's a hybrid between Dracula chimera and Masdevallia picturata. And chimera is a huge flower and picturata is a tiny little thing. And this looks almost mostly like picturata. This is what you see when you try to make Dracularia hybrids intentionally. The Masdevallia parent almost always blows away all of the Dracula features, and you're left with something that looks a lot more like a Masdevallia than Dracula. So just to sum up very quickly, hybridization in the wild amongst Scleriformis is actually quite common, and I think it's probably even part of the rapid speciation mechanism for the Scleriformis. So I'm going to take you on a bit of a travel log through some of the places that I've studied Draculas and look at how human interest in the plants impacts both their protection and the risk that they're in, and interest in their habitat for various human uses is impacting their survival. One of my favorite places to study Draculas is called Reserva Los Cerros. It's north of Quito, and it's pretty difficult to get there. You have to take a bus to this little town called San Miguel de Chonta, and from there you take mules for about 4 to 6 hours up into the forest. And this is me getting ready for my ride, and I struck this Napoleonic pose here for the photo without realizing that the mule's name was Josephine. So, accidental irony there. And this guy is Fausto. He lives along the mud trail that goes up to the reserve, and there are communities along this trail of people who, have lived there for generations. And he had his own orchid collection, and we stopped at his house always because he wanted to show me things and find out what the different names were. He was very, very interested in learning, all the plants that were so fascinating that somebody would travel, across the world to come there and ride a mule up there to see these things. This is the reserve once you get there. It's pristine cloud forest. Generally, if a place is easy to get to, you're not going to find Draculas and you're not going to find Masdevallias. They will have already been stripped out by collectors. So the best places to see these things are very, very hard to get to. And once you get to the reserve the next day, you have to spend the whole day hiking up to these ridges over really awful trails. And most of the Draculas like to hang out on ridges where there are really good breezes. But the reserve is full of amazing things. There's this Masdevallia that doesn't exist in cultivation, Masdevallia hemini, lots of scapulosepalums. This Platy style you can actually see with the naked eye. It's almost 2 inches across. I've never seen a Platy style quite like this. Lopanthes calodictyon, many of you might grow this for its very interesting leaves. There are whole trees that are covered in this, and just a single tree will have the plants, and all the trees around it won't have any on it. So there's something very specific about what this plant likes in a tree. There's things that we have no chance of growing. Brachyonidiums are impossible to grow. Beautiful Lopanthes there. Other things that like Sobralias and Epidendrums. But there's wonderful populations of Draculas. This is a beautiful Dracula Chiroptera. Dracula Felix is all over there. This is one of these flush bloomers. It's a fairly easy one to grow if you've got an immediate collection. Dracula Morley has only ever been seen in this reserve, and nobody has ever found it outside of the reserve in other parts of Ecuador. And it does exist in cultivation. From the very first exploration of the reserve, plants were taken out, so we can't grow it. Dracula Lafleurii, originally from the reserve, but it's now been seen in other parts around the reserve and nearby Ecuador. And this is how Lafleurii grows there. It grows on these fallen trunks, huge, huge plants. I wish my plants looked like this. And as is the case with most Draculas, we grow them in baskets because here are the flowers here. They're hanging down below the plant, just draping into the darkness where they can attract all these little flies to come and pollinate them. And there are things that are still mysterious that might even be new species, but this reserve is very important, not only for Draculas, and a lot of pollination research has been done there, but it's important for a rare monkey species and birds. And unfortunately, the reserve is on the precipice of being torn down because of one of the key threats to Andean cloud forest nowadays, which is mining, both illegal and legal. And Ecuador, under the leadership of Rafael Correa, was selling off the mining rights to a lot of protected lands. And they sold a lot of these rights to Canada. And in South America, this may seem bizarre to us, and it is bizarre, but you can own the surface of the land and put your house and family on it, but that doesn't mean you own what's underneath the land. And that can be sold out from underneath you. And so that's what has happened to this reserve. And so it's under legal attack right now from a Canadian mining company. And we think that Canada is our better behaved neighbor to the north, but when it comes to conservation, they're absolutely terrible. And they have a lot of mining interests all over the world, and they have pressured the community there to support them with, of course, the promise of jobs and development. And one of the saddest, things I've ever heard in all of my travels is Fausto, the guy I was showing you, actually came out against the reserve after working there for 10 plus years because he felt that the mining opportunity was going to be better off for the community. So this is one of the key things that is an obstacle to conservation is how do you provide for better lives for the people who are living around these remote areas when something comes knocking on the door, like a mining company that can promise them the moon.
What are they wanting to mine?
Rare minerals for electronics production, primarily. A lot of the mining interest is based totally on speculation too. They don't have any proof that there's anything useful there, but they're going to buy up the land anyway and just make a stab for it and see what they find. So, yeah, exactly. Another area that's really wonderful to visit for Draculas is Maldonado. This is right on the border between Colombia and Ecuador. And basically, this little town here, you could spit into Colombia from the town center if you wanted to. And this area has the most Dracula diversity. And these are all the species and natural hybrids that have been recorded from there to date. And the area used to be very dangerous because of the Colombian Civil War. And even though it's in Ecuador, it is right on the border here. And during the planned Colombia involvement of the US in the war in Colombia, Colombia was able to push the rebels into some very concentrated areas of the country. And one of the areas that was most concentrated was the border with Ecuador. And Raffle would allow the rebels to come across and have a refuge from the Colombian soldiers right in these areas. So when I used to go there, you know, it wasn't the safest place to be, but there was a guy in town who grew orchids and grew Draculas, and he had his ear to the ground, and he knew people who knew people. So usually when I would go there, you know, he would make sure that there wasn't any really hot activity going on. And I've gone there several times, and even in this very remote place, there's habitat destruction. You know, this is a very beautiful forest here, but I took this photo standing in this cow field, and that cow field wasn't there the previous time that I had been there. And I walked around the perimeter of this thing, and here were all these Dracula and Dendrobium plants growing on the edge, and surely they used to be here where cows were. And going further up into the woods, you know, I saw where they were logging things, and they had felled a tree to chop it up, and underneath it was another Dracula Nosferatu. This is the largest one I've ever seen in the wild. So I pulled it off before it went through the wood chipper and sent it to Quito with someone who grows orchids here. But these deforestations here, what they do is they mill the wood right there in the forest on these steep slopes. And so it's a very inefficient use of the wood. It's all basically hand cut and a tremendous amount of wastage. Oops. So this is also from the Maldonado area. This is a new road cut. And this is an example of how not everything that we do is actually bad for orchids. So this road cut here, you see these very dry slopes here. It looks very inhospitable for orchids, but over time, these road cuts get colonized with plants, and orchids really like to slip in the early phase of these recolonization efforts. They don't like a lot of competition. So once grasses and ferns and things like that take over, orchids get squeezed out. But for a brief period, these road cuts can be really rewarding for looking at orchids. And Dracula Vampira is almost a mythical user of these road cuts. It disappears for decades and nobody knows where it is. And then a road cut will get colonized, and all of a sudden there'll be hundreds of plants of Vampira that came out of the forest from somewhere and have exploded on the road cuts. So my friend found one of these plant collections, and you know, there were 6 or 7 that he had seen, and we went back there to explore it more and climbed up a little bit, and there were really hundreds and hundreds of plants on this road cut of this species that seems to disappear every so often. So, and the point I want to get to is, you know, we think of these areas as remote, even some of them are downright dangerous, but they're still very heavily impacted by human interest in use of the land and even interest in orchids. And one of the trips where I went to Maldonado, we were leaving the town, and I have a really, really bad addiction to Diet Coke. I cannot survive for more than an hour with Diet Coke. And so when I go on these extended trips, I run out of my supply, and it gets to be, you know, pretty serious for me. So we were driving up over the mountain to get out of Maldonado, and there was a little shack, and it had a Coke logo on it. So I made my friend stop so I could get something. And this little old lady who lived there, she only had regular Coke, which I'll take in a pinch. But I went in there, bought my Coke, got back to the car, and she came out and she walked over to the car and she folded her arms and put them on the sill of the car like this and looked at us and said, "Do you boys like orchids?" There was only one reason why a face that looked like this would have ever been on that road, and it's looking for orchids. So she knew what I was there for, and so she took us behind her shack and showed us her orchid collection. And she had some really fascinating things. And her neighbor also grew orchids, and she had growing on her tree this Dracula Eye. This is only the 3rd time that this thing has ever been seen. And this was named also for another San Francisco Orchid Society member, Ron Hawley. So, you know, if she hadn't collected this plant and grown it, we wouldn't know that this thing still exists in the wild. And we've been able to demonstrate that it's a natural hybrid. So the hybridization is continuing to happen in the wild that creates this thing. So collection definitely has its benefits. It's the only way that we learn about what was really going on out there in the wild. On the other hand, you have examples of collection like this. So I got emails from somebody in Ecuador maybe 10 years ago who said, oh, I'm doing this scientific project on the Draculas from Maldonado, and I collected all of these plants. And he showed me like 8 photos of just all these Draculas that he had collected. And when I go to Maldonado, if I see 6 Draculas on a trip, it's been a good trip. So this is an absolute rapage of the forests. And it's just clear that he did not collect these plants. He taught the locals what he was looking for, and he got them to pull these all out of the forest. And there's no value to this whatsoever. This is just chaos. You know, he masked it as a scientific effort, but it was really just an ego collection. I'm going to skip ahead since we're going to run low on time here, but I want to talk to you about how orchids are moved around commercially in South America. There's people who call themselves materos, and when you buy a plant in Latin America, you don't say that you're growing a planta, you say you're growing a mata. A mata is a plant that you grow in a pot. And materos are people who hunt matas. They go out and hunt plants, and they go around throughout the forest and vacuum out all the plants, and they take them door to door to the growers in South America. They know who all the big growers are, and they know exactly what they want. And they will create some pretty fantastic lies in order to be able to sell these wild collected plants that are probably just common things like chimeras. But they'll come and say, oh, I found this rare thing that you've been looking for, and sell it to some unsuspecting collector. They often sell this thing, and every time I go to Colombia, somebody shows me this and says, I have this new species that was collected in the wild, and of course they're thinking I'm going to name it for them. And this is not a wild species at all. This is Dracula jester. It was a hybrid made by J&L Orchids in the 80s. They brought it to Colombia when they were doing shows down there, and the materos, you know, are unscrupulous, and they'll sell anything to anyone with any kind of story that they want. The most amazing thing that I saw was I had a bunch of people in Ecuador and Colombia all at the same time send me these photos of these amazing pure white Draculas and pure red Draculas, and these were just painted. The materos painted them and then convinced people that they had all these, you know, rare color forms, and they were caught doing this with other things, with Coryanthes. You know, they'll find out what you want, and they'll, you know, rip something else out of the wild and sell it to you. So despite the fact that we supposedly have protections to keep the plant safe in the wild, this stuff is going on every day all over the place. And, you know, if you go on eBay nowadays, you can find all these fraudulent ads for Draculas. Look at this, 10 pieces bonsai plant seeds, Dracula simia monkey face orchid. When have you ever counted 10 Dracula seeds or 10 orchid seeds of any kind, you know? I mean, this is absolute nonsense. This is a photo stolen from John Leathers. They have all of these, you know, crazy comments about the plants, like you grow them, you know, by scattering the seeds on the ground, and they smell like ripe oranges. And all of this happened in the last decade or so. There was this monkey orchid craze that took over with people sending photos around saying, oh, look at these amazing monkey orchids. And it's driven this appetite for Draculas such that you can find all this fraudulent stuff online. And I'm really, really, really afraid of the materos ever catching on to this craze, because if they can hook up with, you know, the places in China and Eastern Europe that are perpetrating these frauds and start selling actual Draculas around the world, then that would be a pretty serious risk for the plants in the wild. Now I'm going to jump into some more positive news about things that are going on with discovery of Draculas recently, and it's still definitely possible to find Draculas growing in the wild. One of the most amazing places to go to look for any kind of cloud forest orchids is Tatama National Park in Colombia. When I first started going there, there was a military base at the top of this road, and it was very unvisited. And the first time I went there, we went almost to the military base, and then we ran into a soldier on the way back down. And he said, "I'm surprised you made it that far without us sniping you." So that was 10 years ago. Last time I went there, the military all came out to see me and my friends, and they wanted to take photos and videos of us holding a Columbia flag so that they could use it as part of their promotion to get tourists to come there. So a lot has changed in the last decade, and this area is very, very, very popular with bird watchers. In fact, the bird watchers often go into these areas first, and they take photos of orchids and send them around via Facebook and Instagram. And so there's a very interconnected network in Colombia of people who are interested in nature, and that's how we often find out about these important areas. But it's very remote, wonderful, pristine forest. And there's all kinds of orchids everywhere. This is Dracuphilia Imperiale, and this is about 6 inches across. It's, as far as I know, the largest Dracuphilia. Very, very impressive. And you can even find Miltoniopsis growing there, which most Miltoniopsis have been sucked out of the wild because anybody who sees this flower thinks, "Oh, that's pretty, I'm gonna take it off the tree and bring it home to grandma." So there's a lot of things that seem to be protected there. The first time I went there, we were driving up and I saw something out of the corner of my eye. I said, "Stop the car." I got out and the corner of my eye was right. There were Draculas. And at the time they were only in bud, but we went back a few years later and they turned out to be Dracula carcinopsis. And this is only the second time that this thing has been observed in the wild. And there were a number of populations there. Even those places protected. The last time that I went there, all the plants were gone. So, there's just one road. There's a family that is the guardians of the national park, basically, and they're very, very tight with conservation and good friends of mine. And even with them there, people are getting up here and starting to collect away these important plants. So it's very, very, very hard to protect these things if there's any kind of human access at all. Another interesting species is Dracula Nosferatu. This was an example of something that was grown in a greenhouse without any knowledge of where it was from in the wild, and it turned out to be a real species. For 20 years, nobody knew where it was from. And then my friend Nicolas Elias in Colombia found a population not far from Medellin, about an hour away. But shortly thereafter that he found them, the whole area where they were growing was covered in landmines from the FARC revolutionaries who had been fighting for 40 years against the Colombian government. And I put myself in a lot of dangerous situations with landmines. You don't negotiate with landmines. It is not what you see in the movies. You see in the movies somebody steps on a landmine and it goes click and you say, "Oh no, a landmine. Help, get a rock, put a rock on the landmine so there's still weight and you get off." Landmines don't do that. You step on it, it blows up, that's it. So very, very brutal thing to do to these isolated communities that the park was supposedly fighting for. There were communities out there that were separated from the rest of civilization for decades because they were surrounded by landmines. And eventually the UN came into this area and cleared out the landmines. And a few years ago, some friends found one single Dracula plant in this tiny little tuft of forest on the top of a cow hill. And they said, "Let's go see it." And when I got there, it turned out to be Dracula Nosferatu. So one of the happiest days of my entire life was searching for Draculas. Here's another example of something that was originally in cultivation and turned out to be a valid species. This is sold by Equihenra, and they still sell it to this day as Dracula radiosa. And I got this thing and knew that it wasn't radiosa, and I did some DNA work on it, and it was distinct from radiosa. but we didn't know where it was in the wild. And I have a rule, I have to see the plant on the tree, otherwise I'm not going to name the species because there's too much hybridization that goes on in greenhouses. So some friends were exploring up in Maldonado, and they found it growing in Maldonado. So we named it Dracula Trigonopetala because it has these very triangular shaped petals. And now this area where this thing is from is actually a reserve for Draculas and other orchids created by the Orchid Conservation Alliance and Ipominga and some other organizations. And in fact, the guy who's always been my guardian angel, when I go to Maldonado to let me know if it's dangerous or not, he is basically the reserve manager for there. And the Orchid Conservation Alliance is buying this land in a very smart way. They're buying it altitudinally rather than by area, because orchids are very different at different altitudes. So they're trying to collect and protect the entire range of things that are growing in this area. Final thing that I'll talk about is this Dracula species that I recently named, and there is a reserve not far out of Medellin in Colombia, but it had been an area that was very dangerous for a long time. And a businessman from Cali, who is very interested in hummingbirds, bought up all this land once it became safe to go there and turned it into a reserve that he intended to be a hummingbird research center. But he quickly found that there were some interesting orchids there, and he brought in this forestry expert from Australia, and they discovered a population of Dracula gorgona, and they put online like, oh, look, we found these wonderful new species of Dracula here. And I wrote to them and I said, oh, it's not a new species, it's gorgona. It's good that you found that. And then I found out that I was disinvited from visiting the reserve because I told them that they didn't have a new species. Well, eventually things got smoothed over, and years later I went there, and guess what? I found a new species. If they had let the expert go there in the first place, then they would have gotten a new species. And this reserve, like many reserves, they're always working an angle to try to get funding for protection. So finding new species is big news, and then it attracts donors. And what happened with this thing is it turned out that Leonardo DiCaprio gave money to the reserve, and he basically forced us to name the species after his mother. And I am personally and publicly furious about this. I didn't want to do this, and my co-authors on the paper were all Colombian, and they all signed off on it and said, yes, we're doing this. There is, centuries of history of white people stomping around Latin America, discovering things and naming them after Europeans and other white people who are never, ever, ever, ever going to go there. And I can absolutely guarantee you that Leonardo DiCaprio's mother is never going to this reserve. So I was furious about this, and in fact, one of the workers at the reserve, who was a very well-known reserve warden from other reserves in Colombia, he was murdered shortly before we described the species in an act of eco-violence. There were people who were not happy that conservation was going on in the area, and that the thought of land was going to be saved from their agricultural interests, and so they killed him. And he should have had his name on this plant. So now I have a burning mission to go back there and find another Dracula species so that I can name it after him rather than Leonardo DiCaprio's mother. Anyway, the big message there is that there are still new species to find out. There's a lot of area that has not been explored. Speciation is very, restricted to very small areas in the Andes. So there's a lot of opportunity to discover new things, and not just Draculas, of course. So it's a very, very rich environment that it's becoming very increasingly difficult to protect because of the mining interests, especially in these mountainous areas. So we think that buying up the land is enough to solve the problem, and it's not. Any kind of conservation effort, money needs to be set aside for legal purposes too. for paying people to watch over the land, because it's very common for mining companies to pay people to move into a reserve and set up a little house there. And then once they're discovered, they say, oh, I've lived on this land for 100 years. This has been my land forever. I don't know who you people are. And I just sold it to the mining companies. So those kind of scams are going on, and conservation is really becoming more than just acquiring the land, but it's also protecting it from all these quasi illegal attempts to take it out from underneath us. So here's a whole bunch of people who helped me in all of my efforts to study Draculas in the wild. And, if anyone's interested in having a comprehensive guide, photo guide to Masdevallias and Draculas, Gary Meyer put this book together a good number of years ago, and I helped him out with it, and I still have copies of it. It's just a photo guide. It doesn't really give you any history or cultural advice or anything, but it is pretty comprehensive. And with that, I'll open it up to questions. Thank you.
You're doing DNA analysis. Do you ever use mitochondrial?
That's primarily what I have been using is mitochondrial and plastid DNA. There's a small amount of genomic DNA that I use as well, chromosomal DNA. That's where the better information is. The plastid and chromosomal or mitochondrial DNA is very good for studying very old things that have evolved over a long period of time, but stuff that evolved very recently, you really need to get into the chromosomal DNA. And the techniques are there now, and doing exome sequencing and stuff like that is totally doable. It's just, I don't have the time or the money to do it, so someone else is going to have to take it up.
Are Draculas not found further east in South America?
No, further east you go, it gets very lowland, and within the Amazon you will find chlorothalids. There are definitely chlorothalids all over. There are warm and hot growing chlorothalids, and I wish there was more Brazilian representation in the orchid trade, because there's a lot of interesting stuff in the lowlands that people who have hot growing greenhouses could grow, but we just don't see that stuff as much in cultivation. Anything else?
Do you have any theory on why there's that hard southern border that's just midway through Peru?
No, I don't have a theory. I would not be surprised if it's not real. Bolivia has stopped, 25, 30 years ago being a place where orchid study has really been done, because they have no capacity for CITES there. Their government just doesn't even have an office to do anything like that. So once CITES came along, Bolivia became a big black box to orchid study. So I wouldn't be surprised if there are things further south. It's just, it hasn't been explored.
Nothing online? Anyone online have questions?
Go ahead and unmute yourselves if you have any questions.
How would we get in touch with you to get one of those books, the Masdevallia and Dracula book?
So I have a website, Colombian Orchid Imports. So if you look for that, I have a small business importing orchids from Colombia. I do it just as a favor, so if you look for my website, you'll find how to email me.
Okay, thank you.
I had a question. This is Karen Olson.
Sure, go ahead.
I grow Draculas near my swamp cooler up in Napa, so I'm much warmer than San Francisco. And they do pretty well, though I do get more brown tips on the leaves than I'd like. And I wondered, I do use rainwater to water them, but how often would you recommend that I fertilize them? And would it be like a quarter strength like the other orchids?
I fertilize just the same way that I would, any other orchid. There was this belief decades ago that they needed really weak fertilizer, but that was when most of the people were growing Draculas in parts of the country that had really bad water. So they were already oversalted to begin with. And, these plants are growing next to all the same other orchids. They're growing next to epidendrums and anguillas and lycastes and whatever. And so there's no fertilizer differential in the wild. So, I would just do whatever you do for the bulk of your collection.
Okay, great. And then my brown tips are probably more from maybe them occasionally drying out more than they would like. Would you
Anything that stresses a Dracula will cause brown tips, and I've got brown tips too. And in my case, it's because they often spend too much time being too wet. If there isn't at least a little bit of transpiration and drying out, then they're soggy, weedy all the time. So that's what causes it for me. But it could be too much light. It could be too dry. It's basically the same reaction that happens no matter what's causing the stress. And as long as the plants continue to grow and they try to bloom, then it's ultimately cosmetic. But I'll tell you right now that John Leather's collection is looking absolutely pristine, and he has moved all of his plants into orchiata bark. He doesn't grow anything in moss anymore, and I'm about to make the jump into bark too myself, because moss is getting harder and harder to come by, and I think it strangles the roots and it gets really acidic really quickly. You don't get much lifespan on it. So if you can keep your plants wet enough in bark, then I'd say try orchiata bark and see if that improves the tips.
I'm guessing the seedling mix from them to grow fine.
The finer bark size, and he mixes it with perlite, I don't know, 1/5 perlite, and it's doing wonderfully for me.
Well, thank you, because I just needed to repot mine. It's gotten cool enough. I thought this might be a good time to do it, so I'll try the bark. Thanks.
Just an aside, the orchiata or seedling bark is not easily obtainable on the West Coast. I know that for us to order it, it has to come all the way from back east. It's not coming into the West Coast. So if you can find it, get it.
Yeah, by the way, just this weekend when I went to pick up the plants, I was talking to John, who also, he buys orchiata, and Nancy Davis, who owns Shell Dance right up in the same area, and has a store. She's selling bark, and she's gonna take a request to try to start upping the supplies. So if you're interested, contact me. She'll let you know.
Because at this point, orchiata is, from what Gold Coast has found out, is that it's in a container ship outside of Long Beach. So it's going to be really hard to get stuff.
And I've heard the price is like 6 times what.
And it's also smaller bags as opposed to what it was before.
All right. Any other questions before we move on to the raffle?
Thank you. Good. Yeah.
So.
I like your shirt.
All right, thanks everyone. So we're going to end the Zoom meeting. Nishi, we owe her a round of applause for managing the Zoom meeting online for us today. And Bill for all his help and sound as well. So I got the names of people that were interested in the $10, $20 Tiny Jungle gift certificates online. And we'll follow up on the next day or two when I get time. And email you all, good openers. Not everyone will be able to have it in order people and we're going to go ahead and close the Zoom, but for people in the room interested in the plant raffle, we're going to set up the in the room raffle and then end the meeting. And I just remind everyone that what didn't hear in the beginning, that we're going to have the December 7th meeting here with plants and a white elephant exchange. If you have an orchid or other plants or plant related things you want to bring in and do like an orchid exchange or plant exchange, gift exchange, we'll set that up separately for people participating in that. And we'll also have I think Ron, Boris, and Jason Douglas are providing a plant table as well. So we'll have that as well as, thank you, as well as the starting skills session I mentioned on visa culture with some visas available as well from Paul Berger. So we'll end there. So we're going to shut off Zoom. Thanks all.
Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next week. Not next week. Oh,
Next month.
yeah, next month. Are you sleeping?